The evacuation center at Kasara Station smelled like cold metal, recycled air, and fear. Davin Cole had been working the intake desk for 11 days straight when the Velhari transport arrived. He was a logistics coordinator, a civilian, third-tier clearance, no particular heroism in his record, and he had come to Kasara 4 months ago to manage supply routing after the Accord collapse left 3 border sectors without functional infrastructure. He hadn't come to be a refugee coordinator. He hadn't come to sort children into dormitory assignments and fill out ration cards and explain, in careful terms, why the station's medical wing was at capacity and what the backlog timeline looked like, and which families could expect assignment to the secondary wing by the end of the week. But the Accord had collapsed, and the border sectors were broken, and the Velhari transport had docked at Bay 9 40 minutes ago, carrying 217 displaced civilians. And Davin was the only person on shift who had a working translation unit. The station's language officer was down with a respiratory virus that had moved through the staff at impressive speed over the last 4 days, and the secondary interpreter had been pulled to Bay 12 for a dispute between 2 Rahari families that required immediate mediation, and that left Davin, who had exactly 1 language unit and a 4-page cultural briefing he had read in the cargo lift on the way down, standing in front of Bay 3's double doors, while the subharmonic sound of 200 frightened Velhari filtered through the metal. He heard them before he saw them. Velhari were not a quiet people in distress. Their voices had a particular resonance, a subharmonic in their speech that humans felt more than heard, a low vibration in the sternum that the translation unit's designers had apparently decided not to filter. The sound of 200 frightened Velhari filling the corridor outside intake Bay 3 was something Davin suspected he would hear in his sleep for years. He put down his water, squared his shoulders, and went to open the intake bay doors. The first thing he noticed was how many children there were. The Velhari looked broadly humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, bipedal, faces arranged in the approximate configuration of eyes and mouth and nose that a human brain found recognizable. Their differences were in the details. Velhari skin ran in shades from pale silver blue to deep midnight indigo, and in the overhead fluorescent of the station's corridors, the colors caught and shifted like the inside of a shell. Their ears came to points, their eyes when they turned to look at him, and they all turned to look at him. 200 displaced civilians going silent in a single breath were double-ringed. A narrow outer ring of color, a wide inner iris, pupils that contracted to verticals in the harsh overhead light. The children stared at him with those eyes wide open. Davin had worked intake for 11 days. He knew the look by now, the too quiet, too still expression of children who had learned not to draw attention. He had seen it on human children, on Rahari children, on the handful of Savan families who had come through Bay 2 on day 6. Children who had been through something understood at a cellular level that stillness was safer than noise. He stepped forward and held up his hands, palms out, which the translation unit's cultural notes said was a recognized neutral gesture across 6 of the 7 major Velhari regional dialects. He made a point of being slow about it, making his own stillness visible. "You're safe here," he said. "My name is Davin. I work intake. We're going to get everyone registered, find quarters, and get food in front of you inside the next 2 hours. I need you to be patient with me. We have limited staff, and I'm going to ask for your help keeping the children calm while we process." The translation unit rendered his words in Velhari, and he watched the subharmonic of the crowd shift, still frightened, but something in it eased, like a knot partly loosened. A woman near the front of the group stepped forward. She was tall, even by Velhari standards, with silver-white hair pinned back severely and pale blue-gray skin that had the particular drawn quality of someone who had not slept in a long time. She wore what might once have been a good coat, good fabric, good cut, but it was torn at the left shoulder and smudged with something that had dried dark. She held a small child against her left side with an arm that did not shake, and Davin noted, in the automatic cataloging way of 11 days of intake, that the child's eyes were closed. Sleeping, he thought at first. Then he looked again. The child's eyes were closed, but her face was turned toward him. Her head was tilted slightly, that particular tilt of orientation, the adjustment of angle to compensate for one sense with another. And when the woman stepped forward and the child came with her, the child's face tracked the movement of Davin's voice with a precision that had nothing to do with sight. Not sleeping, blind. Davin had been doing intake for 11 days. He had processed grief and fear and exhaustion and quiet dignity, and occasionally rage. He had learned to process his own reactions quickly and privately, and keep his face steady, because the people across the desk needed steady more than they needed his feelings. He kept his face steady now. "I'll need a primary contact for the group," he said, looking at the woman with the good coat. "Are you the senior representative?" The translation unit rendered it. The woman looked at him for a long moment, the kind of assessment that had nothing to do with his words and everything to do with his face, and then said, in accented but usable galactic standard, "I speak your language. I served as a diplomatic interpreter before." "Then that makes this easier," Davin said. "Come with me. Your group can wait in the intake bay. It's warm and there are seats. I'll have water brought." The woman's name, she told him when they reached the desk, was Selen Vor Aria. She had been a civil interpreter for the Velhari diplomatic office on the border post at Renkavith, past tense, because Renkavith had been evacuated in the second week of the Accord collapse, and the diplomatic office had relocated to Kasara pending restructuring, and she had been assigned to accompany the civilian transport as a language intermediary. "And the child," Davin said, because the child was still pressed against Selen's side, very still, her face angled toward the sound of his voice. Selen's expression did something complicated. "She was separated from her family in the Renkavith evacuation," she said, carefully. "I found her in the secondary terminal. She was alone. I have been caring for her since." "Name?" "She has not told me her name. She has not spoken." Davin looked at the child. She was small. He would have put her at 5 or 6 years by human measure, though Velhari aged differently and he didn't have enough experience to calibrate accurately. Her skin was a shade darker than Selen's, a deep blue-violet, and her hair was white and fine, and had been carefully braided by someone, Selen, he suspected, from the slightly inexpert neatness of it. Her eyes were closed, and the skin around them had the faint sunken quality of someone who didn't use them. She had, he noticed, turned her face slightly more toward him as he looked at her. He was not a man given to impulse. 11 days of intake had, if anything, reinforced his natural tendency toward procedure and patience. But he was also a man who had grown up with a younger sister who had been afraid of strangers, and he remembered with great clarity that the worst thing you could do with a frightened child was ignore her. He looked at the child and said quietly, "Hello." The translation unit rendered it. The child's head tilted. "My name is Davin," he said. "You don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything. You're safe." The child's chin came up a fraction of an inch, as though she were testing the air. Then she turned her face back toward Selen and pressed herself slightly closer, and that was that. Davin went back to the intake forms. The Velhari group took 4 hours to process, not 2, because the ration system crashed at the 40-minute mark and had to be manually reset, and because 3 of the adults had medical needs that required him to personally walk their documentation to the medical wing, rather than route it through the automated system, and because 8 children under the age of 4 required their own separate intake cards, which nobody had anticipated when the intake bay was designed. When the last family finally had their quarters assignment and their ration cards and their orientation packet, Davin sat down in the chair behind the intake desk and put his head in his hands for exactly 45 seconds. Then he stood up, because there was a second transport docking at Bay 12, and someone needed to be at the desk. He found the child sitting outside the intake bay. She was alone. She was sitting with her back against the corridor wall, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, face angled toward the corridor's air circulation vent, tracking it, he realized, the way she tracked voices, orienting herself by airflow and sound and the particular subharmonic texture of a station's mechanical breathing. She looked very small against the gray metal wall. Her braid had come partly loose on one side, the fine white hair trailing against her shoulder, and she had not bothered to do anything about it. Davin stopped. He looked up and down the corridor. No Velhari adults visible. No sign of Selenvor Aria. He looked back at the child. She had noticed him. Her face had shifted fractionally in his direction, not toward the sound of his footsteps, he realized, but a moment before he'd made any sound, as though she detected something else. The change in air pressure when the intake bay door opened, maybe. The slight displacement of the circulation pattern around his body. He didn't know enough about Velhari sensory biology to guess with any accuracy. He crouched down to her level. "Hey," he said. The translation unit wasn't on his belt, he'd left it at the desk. He said in very slow, careful galactic standard, "Where is Selen?" The child's lips parted. She still didn't speak. But her hand came up, very slightly in what he thought might be a gesture, a direction, an indication. He looked down the corridor. Selenvor Aria was visible at the far end, speaking with two Velhari adults, her back to the child. "Okay," he said, "I see her." He didn't move away. He stayed crouched at the child's level, and after a moment he settled himself against the wall beside her, not touching, just parallel, another person sitting in a corridor, and let the corridor be quiet. The child's head turned toward him. He said, because it was the only Velhari word he knew with any confidence, Sarath. It meant something like all right or safe asterisk in the dialect most common on the border posts. He'd picked it up from the Velhari staff who had passed through intake on days 3 and 4, a low word they used to settle children in the waiting room. The child's breath changed, just slightly. Not a relaxation exactly, more like the quality of wariness recalibrating, the way a very careful person recalibrates when new evidence arrives. Then she leaned very slightly toward him. Not touching, just angling, orienting herself to him the way she oriented to air vents as a fixed point worth knowing. Davin sat there in the corridor and did not move, and after a while Selenvor Aria looked down the hall and saw them and walked back, and her expression when she arrived was complicated in a way he didn't have vocabulary for yet. "She does not usually," Selen started. "It's fine," Davin said. "She was just waiting." He did not expect to see the child again. Kesara Station had 800 civilian refugees, a staff of 42, and a logistics problem that was actively worsening as more transports arrived from the collapsed border sectors. Davin had a job to do and a very long list of things the job required, and he was not a man who expected personal continuity in a crisis. You help the person in front of you, and then you help the next person, and you didn't build attachment to the through flow because the through flow was exactly that, through and moving, people arriving and being processed and placed and moved again toward whatever came next. That night he read the cultural briefing on Velhari sensory biology that he had downloaded but never opened. It was short and not particularly detailed, 4 pages, written for embassy staff, aimed at preventing accidental offense rather than genuine understanding, but it noted several things he found useful. Velhari who were blind from birth developed their other senses with a specificity that fully sighted Velhari did not. Their scent identification was, by human olfactory standards, remarkable. They could distinguish individuals by scent reliably across significant distances, and could track a known scent through crowds and recycle their environments. Their spatial mapping was tactile kinesthetic. They built three-dimensional models of spaces through movement and touch and the feel of airflow, and these models, once built, were highly stable. They navigated known spaces with a confidence that could look, from the outside, like sight. The briefing also noted that Velhari children who were mute or selectively nonverbal often communicated through touch and subharmonic vocalizations, and that these were not lesser forms of communication. They were forms with their own grammar and their own precision, which took time and attention to read correctly. He filed this information and went back to the intake queue. He saw the child the next morning. She was in the station cafeteria, sitting with Selin Vor Arya and two other Velhari women at one of the long tables. She had her hands flat on the table and her eyes closed and her face angled up, and Davin understood, watching from the food line, that she was mapping the space, building a picture of the room from sound and air, and the particular subharmonic of Velhari conversation around her. He watched her head move, very slightly, tracking each new source of sound, filing it, adjusting the mental map with the same methodical patience she had shown with the air circulation vent the night before. She was very good at it, patient, deliberate. There was nothing frantic in the process. It was thorough, systematic work, the kind that required you to be quiet enough inside to hear what was there. He got his food and found an empty space at a different table and sat down and started eating, because the cafeteria was full, and he had 40 minutes before he needed to be back at the desk. He watched her work for another minute before he looked away. The cafeteria was not a small room, 30 meters across at least, 30 tables, 2 food stations and a beverage counter, and a far wall with windows that looked out onto a service corridor. 11 days in, and Davin still sometimes forgot which of the 2 entry doors opened to the main corridor and which went to the secondary wing. She was mapping it with the same systematic patience she had brought to the air vent in the intake corridor the night before, and she was doing it alone, in a room full of strangers, with the quiet competence of someone who has decided that the world is worth knowing and has developed the tools to know it. The child's face turned toward him. He noted it, an automatic registering of the fact, and kept eating. 3 minutes later, the child slid off her bench. Selin reached for her, said something sharp in Velhari. The child did not stop. She walked carefully, slowly, hands at her sides, but with a very slight extension of her fingers that suggested she was reading the air displacement around her, through the cafeteria, navigating around benches and tables with a precision that made people move out of her way simply because of how certain her trajectory was. She did not hesitate at obstacles. She adjusted, without breaking stride, as though she had already calculated the room's geometry and was simply executing against a known map. She walked directly to Davin's table. She stopped in front of him and turned her face up, and he could see her nostrils moving actively, deliberately, and he understood then that it was his scent she had tracked. Not his voice, not the displacement of air from his movement, not any sound he had made. His scent, specifically, across a cafeteria full of humans and Velhari and Rahari and Savan, in an enclosed space with shared recycled air. He sat very still. The child reached out and touched the edge of his table. Then she touched the edge of his tray, very lightly, exploratory. Then she found the edge of his sleeve. Davin did not move. She stood there with 2 fingers resting against the cuff of his uniform sleeve, her face turned up toward his, and she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and the cafeteria continued its noise around them. Then she climbed onto the bench across from him and sat down, and folded her hands on the table, and waited. Selin Vor Arya arrived 40 seconds later, out of breath, her expression oscillating between alarm and something else that he couldn't name. "I am sorry," she said. She does this occasionally. If she takes a strong interest in someone, she will track them until she finds them. With the Velhari adults in the group, it happens sometimes, but it has never with a human. "It's all right," Davin said. "She has not done it with anyone on the station. Not outside our group. She can sit, he said. I have 35 minutes. Selin looked at him. Then she looked at the child. The child's face was tilted toward Davin with an expression of calm attention that was, he thought, the most settled he had seen her. Selin sat down. They ate breakfast. The child did not eat. She had apparently eaten already. But she sat across from Davin for the full 35 minutes and mapped the cafeteria with the patient, methodical precision of someone doing serious work, occasionally tilting her face toward him when his fork or cup made a sound, orienting herself against the known point of him. When Davin stood to go, the child's face tracked him all the way to the door. He learned the child's name on day 4. She still hadn't spoken. Selin, who had been making careful inquiries through the other Velhari refugees, had managed to compile a partial picture. The child was from the Keth Sora quarter of Ren Kavith, which had been the administrative district, government offices, diplomatic quarters, the civil registry. She had been found in the secondary transit terminal alone, with no emergency identification tag and no adult accompanying her. Whatever had happened to her family in the evacuation was, so far, unknown. What Selin had not been able to determine was the child's name, because the child would not speak it, and her emergency tag was missing. On day 4, Davin was doing routine welfare checks on the dormitory wings, part of the intake coordinator's secondary duties, checking that families had what they needed and that ration distribution was reaching everyone. And he found the child sitting in the corridor outside the Velhari dormitory section, alone again, in the same configuration. Back against the wall, knees up, face tilted toward the air circulation. Her braid had been redone, neater this time, Selin or one of the other women, and she had a small folded square of fabric in her lap that she was turning over and over in her hands, feeling its edges. He sat down next to her. He did this because it had worked before, not because he had a plan. He was a logistics coordinator. He did not have training in child welfare or trauma response or any of the things a proper specialist would have brought to this situation. What he had was the memory of his younger sister and the instinct that presence, quiet, non-demanding, reliable presence, was sometimes the thing that mattered when nothing else was available. He sat down, and the child leaned against his arm. It happened without preamble. She simply tilted until her shoulder was against his arm, and then she stayed there, apparently satisfied with this arrangement, and he sat very still and did not make it a thing because making it a thing would have been the wrong response. After a while she made a sound. Not speech, not quite. A single syllable, soft, subharmonic, the way Velhari children apparently vocalized when they were uncertain of something. He didn't know what it meant. He looked down at her. She was tracing something on the back of his hand with one finger. He watched the pattern 7 strokes, in a particular configuration, repeated twice, precise and deliberate. He didn't recognize it, but he did recognize after a moment that she was writing, not random motion. A character specific and repeatable. He opened his translation unit. He found the Velhari written character set. He had never needed it before, had only the barest awareness that Velhari had a syllabic script, and looked at the character she was tracing. 7 strokes, particular configuration. The translation unit told him the character was *Vel*, which was a root syllable in Velhari names, most common as an opening unit in given names of the formal register. The child traced it again. She was watching him, watching the sounds he made, the way his breath changed, and traced it again. Vel, he said. She made a sound. Affirmative, the translation unit flagged it. Is that your name, Vel? Another sound. Slightly different, a negative, but gentle, corrective, the tone of someone clarifying rather than refusing. She held up her hand and traced 2 more characters quickly in the air, as though she'd been waiting for him to get to the point where she could give him the full thing. Velura. Velara, he said. She went very still. Then she smiled, a small, private, decisive smile. The smile of someone who has been looking for a way to introduce herself for 4 days and has finally found the mechanism. Velara, he said again, making it a statement rather than a question. She leaned against his arm a little more firmly. Confirmation. He sat in the corridor with Velara for another 20 minutes, until Selin came looking and found them and stopped in the doorway with an expression that had now moved, Davin noted, from complicated to something he might have called grateful if he'd known her better. He found, over the following days, that Velara had decided he was her fixed point. She appeared in the cafeteria at the seat across from his every morning before he arrived. She appeared in the corridor outside intake bay 3 during his afternoon break, sitting against the wall with her knees up, which he had come to understand was her version of waiting. She tracked him by scent with an accuracy that the station staff found remarkable and that Davin found, after the initial surprise wore off, simply practical. She needed to know where things were, and he was apparently one of the things. He brought her a cup of warm liquid from the Velhari food station on day 5, something that smelled vaguely of mineral water, and turned out to be a standard Velhari children's drink, restorative and mild. And she held the cup in both hands and turned her face up at him with an expression he had not seen before, something open and warm, and made a sound that his translation unit rendered as *good. He started bringing it every morning. She had, by day 5, also acquired a working social arrangement with 3 Velhari children in the dormitory wing. Siblings, Selin told him, from the Ren Caveth Market District, names Vel Keth, Yara Keth, and small Sovi Keth, who was 3 years old and largely communicated through pointing at things. Velara had found them by the sound of Sovi's pointing accompanied vocalizations on day 3, and had apparently determined that this group was worth knowing, and they had arrived at their arrangement through a process Davin hadn't witnessed, but which appeared to involve a game built around sound patterns and palm tracing that all 4 of them could participate in regardless of age or language. The Keth children had, Selin reported with an expression of mild bewilderment, taken to following Velara rather than the other way around. She navigates, Selin said. She knows the wing, they follow her through it. She's been mapping it for 3 days, Davin said. She knows every junction. Yes, but she also, Selin stopped. She leads them. She is 7 years old and she leads them, and they simply accept this. Davin thought about the decisive smile, and Velara identifying a seat as his in the cafeteria before he'd used it twice, and the way she'd climbed onto the bench across from him with the serenity of someone making an obvious decision. That seems about right, he said. Selin Vor Arya came to the intake desk on day 6 with the expression of someone who had news they were not sure how to deliver. She set a data pad on the desk. He looked at it. It was a civil registry record, Velhari format, translated into galactic standard in the right margin, the formatting precise and official, and carrying the particular visual weight of documents that have institutional significance. He read the name at the top. Velara Sova Keth, age 7 years, Keth Sara Quarter, Ren Caveth Administrative District, guardian of record, Myra Sova Keth. He scrolled down. He read the entry beside Myra Sova Keth. He read it twice, carefully, to be sure he was reading it correctly. Then he looked up at Selin. Her mother, he said, is the Queen Regent of the Keth Sova line. Selin's mouth compressed. The civil registry does not use that title, but yes, the correct title is Sovereign Voice of the Keth Sova succession, which in practical terms means she holds the governance authority for the Keth Sova lineage and its territorial designations, roughly equivalent to a regional head of state within the Velhari federal structure. She's the queen. The equivalent within Velhari governance structure. Davin looked at the data pad. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at the intake bay door, beyond which Velara was, at this moment, almost certainly in the corridor outside the Velhari dormitory section, leading the Keth children through some exercise in spatial mapping. Then he said, "Where is her mother?" "Unknown. The Renkavith evacuation records show the Sovereign Voice was separated from her household staff in the secondary terminal incident on day 3 of the evacuation. There is a search in progress. The Velhari diplomatic office has been," Selin paused, "has been managing the communication carefully. They do not want it known publicly that the Sovereign Voice's daughter is here, because the political situation is. Because it would create a security situation." "Yes." Davin looked at the data pad again. He thought about a 7-year-old girl tracing her own name on the back of his hand in a corridor because she had run out of other ways to introduce herself. He thought about the careful, patient way she mapped rooms she couldn't see, and the small, decisive smile when he got her name right, and the way she had climbed onto the bench across from him in the cafeteria on the second morning, with the serene confidence of someone making an obvious and necessary decision. "Tell the diplomatic office," he said, "that Velara is safe, she is healthy, she has been well cared for, and she will continue to be well cared for until her mother is located. Tell them that any security arrangements they require around that fact are ones I will cooperate with fully. Tell them also that Velara has found her way around most of the intake wing and the dormitory corridor, and if they want to minimize her exposure, they should move the request through me rather than trying to restrict her movement, because restricting her movement will not work and will make her less settled." Selin looked at him. "That's all," he said, and went back to his intake forms. Days 7 and 8 ran. The station's logistics problems did not resolve themselves simply because a small Velhari girl had decided Davin Cole was a fixed point worth tracking. The secondary dormitory wing developed a water pressure issue that required 12 hours of manual assessment and 2 trips to the engineering section on the far side of the station. A transport carrying Savan refugees arrived with 4 families in medical distress that the Bay 1 team couldn't process alone. The ration system crashed again on day 8 morning and required a complete manual audit. Davin worked. He managed the problems that needed managing. He ate breakfast across from Velara in the cafeteria, brought her warm mineral drink, and sat in the corridor outside the dormitory wing during his afternoon breaks while she and the Keth children ran their mapping exercises. On day 7, she showed him the mapping. He didn't understand it at first. She was tracing on his palm again, the way she had with her name, but more complex, multiple strokes in a grid-like pattern that repeated and branched. He watched it for a while, opening his translation unit to check if any of the characters matched, and found that they didn't. These weren't Velhari script characters at all. They were her own system, a notation she had developed for recording spatial information through touch. He spent his evening break trying to work out the logic of it. By the time he had to go back to the desk, he'd identified that certain repeating patterns corresponded to junctions, places where corridors met, and that a specific short stroke appeared to mark the air circulation vents. A longer stroke with a curved end seemed to indicate a door. A pattern of 3 parallel marks appeared near the cafeteria's representation, and it took him 20 minutes to realize they corresponded to the 3 food stations along the far wall. She had mapped the cafeteria in greater detail than he had consciously registered in 11 days of eating breakfast in it. On day 8, he tried tracing back at her. He mapped, very roughly, the junction between the intake bay corridor and the main station thoroughfare, using the patterns he'd worked out the night before. He drew it carefully on the back of her hand, 1 junction mark, 2 corridor lines, the vent symbol he was fairly sure he'd read correctly. Velara went completely still. Then she took his hand and corrected 2 of his strokes with precise, patient authority. The correction was not impatient. It was the correction of someone who cares that the information is accurate, who understands that a map is only useful if it's right. She traced the junction back at him perfectly, then added 2 more junctions he hadn't included, and then, and this was the part he didn't expect, she added a notation he hadn't seen before, a small overlapping mark near the second junction that his translation unit couldn't parse. He looked at it, he looked at the junction it marked. He thought about the corridor physically, and then he understood. There was a slight step down at that junction, a threshold where 2 sections of flooring met, low enough that a sighted person never thought about it, and high enough that a child navigating by feel needed to know it was there. She had a symbol for hazards. She turned her face toward him with the expression he had come to understand, meant she was satisfied with the lesson's progress. He was, he decided, being taught cartography by someone who understood cartography as a survival skill rather than an abstraction, and who taught it with the rigorous clarity of someone for whom the map was not a representation of the world but a tool for moving through it. He kept up with the lessons. He started keeping notes. The Sovereign Voices people arrived on day 9. They were not subtle about it. 6 Velhari in formal security detail, deep midnight blue skin and white hair braided back, wearing what Davin recognized after a moment as ceremonial rather than tactical armor, which he supposed meant the threat assessment was formal rather than operational. They came through intake bay 1 at the shift change, which meant Davin was at the desk, and they stopped in front of him. The lead, a woman with the particular bearing of someone who had spent years making corridors adjust to her presence before they'd consciously decided to, said, in precise galactic standard, "We are here on behalf of the sovereign voice of the Keth Sova succession. We understand her daughter is under your care." "She is," Davin said. "She's in the dormitory wing. I'll take you." He came around the desk and led them down the corridor. They followed with measured steps, and he was aware of being assessed the entire way, not hostile, not threatening, simply thorough. The kind of assessment applied to things that might be relevant to something important. "How is she?" the lead asked. "Healthy, calm. She's been mapping the station. She has most of the intake wing and the dormitory corridor committed to memory. She eats well. She sleeps. She's settled. She has spoken. Not in words, she communicates. She traced her name for me on day 4, and she's been teaching me her spatial notation system for the past 2 days." The lead was quiet for a moment, and in her silence was something that might have been surprise carefully managed. "She has been selectively mute since early childhood," the lead said. It is a condition she has managed with help. The blindness is separate, congenital." "I know," Davin said. He didn't elaborate. He had done his research in the margins of 12-hour shifts, in the 20 minutes before sleep and the 30-minute overlap between night and morning duties, because he had found a child alone in a corridor, and the correct thing to do was understand what she needed and what was working. They reached the dormitory wing. Davin opened the door. Velara was sitting in the center of the common room with the 3 Keth children. She had Sovi in her lap. The 3-year-old had apparently decided that Velara's lap was an acceptable location and had installed himself there with the conviction of someone who has identified optimal seating, and Vel Keth and Yara Keth were on either side of her. And they were running the sound pattern game that Davin still didn't entirely understand, but that appeared to involve sequences of palm taps and tonal responses, and occasional quiet laughter from Yara Keth when someone got a sequence wrong. The security lead stepped into the room. Velara's head came up. She had mapped this room 4 days ago, and she knew every person in it by the sound of their breathing and the particular quality of their steps on the metal floor. She had never encountered these 6 people before. Her face went carefully still, not frightened. Davin had learned to distinguish frightened from careful, and she passed Sovi to Yara Keth with the unhurried efficiency of someone who anticipates needing their hands free. The security lead said something in Velhari soft, something that had the cadence of a specific formal greeting, not a general greeting, a court greeting, one with precise protocol attached. Velara's head tilted. He could see her parsing it, placing it against the catalog she had presumably carried since before she could walk. She stood up. She was very small, and the 6 security detail were very large, and she stood up and walked toward them with the measured confidence of someone who has decided that confidence is the appropriate response. And she stopped in front of the lead and held out her hand flat, palm up, the Velhari formal greeting in return, and waited. The lead went to one knee. The other 5 followed. In the common room, the 3 Keth children went very still. Velara accepted this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who had been taught that grace under difficult circumstances was a skill worth having, and had apparently taken the lesson seriously. Then she turned around and walked back toward the doorway. Toward Davin. She found him, as she always did before she reached him, her face angling in the last few steps with the particular precision of scent tracking, certain and accurate across a room full of people, and she stopped in front of him and reached up and found his sleeve and held on to it. The security lead, still observing from across the room, said very quietly, "She has bonded to you." Davin looked down at the small hand on his sleeve. "She needed someone steady," he said. "It was available." "That is not how Velhari bonding works," the lead said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite solemnity, but lived in the register between them. He asked about Velhari bonding that night. He had the cultural briefing, 4 pages, inadequate, and access to the station's general database, which had a standard anthropological entry on Velhari social biology that was 12 years old and written by a human researcher who had, Davin suspected, spent most of their time on ship rather than in Velhari communities. He read it anyway. The entry noted that Velhari formed strong biological attachment bonds across their lifespan, and that these bonds were established through extended proximity and sensory familiarity, scent, sound, subharmonic resonance. It noted that Velhari children formed their primary attachments in the first years of life, and that these attachments were remarkably stable. A bond formed in early childhood persisted through separation, through time, through the neurological changes of development. It noted that blind Velhari, who navigated primarily by scent and sound, formed attachment bonds with particular specificity, attaching to the precise scent signature of a known person rather than to a generalized sensory category. The entry did not address what happened when a Velhari child formed such a bond with a human. He closed the database and went to bed and found that he was not particularly troubled by not knowing. He was a logistics coordinator. He handled the information available to him and prepared for the problems that were coming, and did not expend energy on the problems he couldn't see yet. What he knew was that Velara had found him in the cafeteria on day 2, had traced her name on his hand on day 4, had been teaching him cartography since day 7, and held his sleeve when she was done being formal. The rest would resolve itself when it arrived. The sovereign voice arrived on day 11. Davin knew she was coming because the diplomatic office sent him a message at 600 that said, in very formal terms, that the sovereign voice of the Keth Sova succession had been located and was being transported to Kasara Station and would arrive at Base 7 at approximately 1400 hours, and that he would please ensure the child was prepared and that the transition would be handled with appropriate discretion. He read the message, filed it, and went to find Velara. She was in the cafeteria, in her usual morning configuration, sitting across from where he normally sat, hands flat on the table, waiting. He had learned, over the past several days, that she did this every morning. She found his usual seat by memory and scent, and some calculation he would never be able to fully reconstruct, sat across from it, and waited for him to arrive. It was the most efficient greeting system he had ever encountered, and he could admit privately, come to depend on it as a reliable start to the day. He sat down across from her. She turned her face toward him with the particular expression that meant she was reading the difference in his scent, a change in him that she apparently detected before he consciously registered it himself. He said carefully, in the slow galactic standard he used with her, "Your mother is coming today." Velara went very still. "She's safe," he said. "She was looking for you. She's coming here at 1400. That's a few hours from now." He watched the stillness resolve. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't the complicated grief of a child who has been alone too long and has learned to be cautious about hope, who has built defenses against the arrival of what they want most. It was something more like a child who had always been certain her mother was coming and was now rearranging that certainty into the practical shape of today specifically, today at 1400. She nodded, precise, decided. "Do you want to go to Bay 7 together?" he said. She nodded again. Then she reached across the table and found his hand and traced something on the back of it, not her name this time, a different pattern, 3 strokes, clean and deliberate, a character he didn't recognize. He opened his translation unit under the table and found it. "Thank you." Davin looked at that for a moment. "You're welcome," he said. She brought her warm mineral drink to her face and held it in both hands and sat across from him in the cafeteria while the morning shift changed around them, and he ate breakfast, and neither of them said anything else, and it was, he thought, one of the more companionable breakfasts he'd had in 4 months. At 1400, they went to Bay 7. The diplomatic office had arranged a private receiving bay, a small room off the main docking corridor, no public observation, the kind of space used for formal arrivals that the station didn't want to become public spectacles. 2 Velhari diplomatic staff waited inside, along with 4 of the 6 security detail from Day 9, who acknowledged Davin with the contained professionalism of people who have decided someone is not a problem and have filed that decision permanently. Velara stood beside him. She had her hand through his arm, not quite holding his hand, not quite not, a configuration she had developed on Day 6 that fit somewhere between child holding a sleeve and something more deliberate, and that he had decided some time ago to take as the compliment it appeared to be. The transport doors opened. Davin had looked up the sovereign voice of the Keth Sova succession after Day 6, because he believed in having accurate information. He had found formal registry images, a Velhari woman in ceremonial dress, deep blue-violet skin, the same shade, he had noted, as Velara's white hair worn in the formal style of the Keth Sova court, an expression that conveyed the particular quality of someone who has been managing very large amounts of responsibility for a very long time and has made their peace with this fact. The woman who came through the transport doors looked like those images, except that the ceremonial dress was replaced by practical travel clothes, and the formal expression had been replaced by something that had nothing formal about it whatsoever. She stopped in the doorway. Her eyes found Velara instantly, the rapid, systematic assessment of a parent who has been afraid, moving over the child and cataloging for evidence of harm, checking posture and color and expression, and the particular quality of how she was standing. Davin watched the precise moment the assessment completed and came back clean, and the thing that happened in her face when it did, some essential tension releasing, the held breath of 11 days finally let out. Then her eyes moved to him. Different kind of assessment, more personal, less systematic and more interested, he thought, in things he wouldn't know how to name even afterward, looking for things that weren't visible in a data pad record or a diplomatic office briefing. Velara's head had turned. Her nostrils were moving, tracking, mapping, orienting herself to the new presence with the same methodical precision she brought to every new space, testing the air, sorting the scent from the recycled station atmosphere. Then very clearly she placed it. The sound she made was not a word. It was a single breath, an intake of air, the subharmonic vocalization of recognition, A sound Davin understood without the translation unit that had a specific biological meaning, an old meaning, something the body knew before the mind caught up, and she let go of his arm and walked forward, and the sovereign voice came forward to meet her, and they met in the center of the room. The queen of the Keth Sova succession went to her knees on the metal floor and gathered her daughter into her arms and did not say anything at all for a long moment, and the room was entirely quiet around them. Davin stood by the wall and found something to look at that was not the two of them, because some moments were not for witnesses. It was the sovereign voice who spoke to him first. Velara was sitting with two of the diplomatic staff. One of them had produced a small item that made specific sounds when touched, a calibrated sound tool, and Velara was cataloging these with the focused enthusiasm she brought to all new information, already identifying patterns the staff member hadn't intended, and the sovereign voice crossed the room to where Davin stood by the wall. "Davin Cole," she said. Her galactic standard was precise and measured and entirely fluent, the kind of fluency that came from years of practical use rather than formal study. Logistics Coordinator, 3rd Tier Clearance, Kesara Station, 12 years with the Accord Infrastructure Division. 11 years and 9 months, as of the last formal review, he said. The 12th year won't complete until next month. A very slight pause, the corner of her expression moved. As of last month, the file says. The file may have rounded. It may have, she agreed, and there was something in her voice, a consideration, a recalibration of something. He waited. My daughter, the sovereign voice said, does not bond easily. She has specific ways of navigating the world, and bonding is not a thing she does without deliberate and sustained cause. She has bonded to very few people. Myself, her nursemaid, who has been with us since Velara's first year, the security staff member who spent 18 months teaching her to navigate by sound pattern when she was 3. I'm aware I'm outside the usual category, Davin said. You are, she looked at him steadily. I am told she found you in the cafeteria on the 2nd day of her time here, that she crossed a full cafeteria by scent alone to reach you. Yes. She has never tracked a human by scent. Velhari, yes, family members, familiar staff, but humans carry a different scent profile. The attachment biology is not designed to calibrate to it. For her to track you that specifically, that reliably across 9 days. She did it every day, Davin said, sometimes several times. The sovereign voice's breath changed, very slightly. She did not speak to you. No, she traced her name on my hand on day 4. She's been teaching me her spatial notation, a cartography system she developed herself for the past several days. We haven't needed words. The sovereign voice was quiet. What did you do? She said. It was not an accusatory question. It was a genuine one from someone trying to understand how something had happened that she hadn't expected to be possible. Davin thought about it, because she deserved an accurate answer. I sat down, he said. She sat down, we didn't bother each other. After that, I brought the drink she likes in the morning and I sat in the corridor while she was teaching the other children the maps. I kept the translation unit on Velhari social registers. He paused. I looked up her condition, her specific history of navigating. I wanted to understand what she needed, not just what was available. The sovereign voice looked at him for a long time. She calls you something, she said. Davin looked back at her. Not in my presence. She does not speak in my presence, you are aware of this. A pause. But the security staff who have been here since day 9 reported something. They said she has a vocalization she uses specifically and only when she is tracking you, when she detects that you are near. Another pause, considered. It is a subharmonic registration, not quite speech, but not ambient sound. A sound attached to a specific person, which she produces on approach. I don't have enough Velhari to have caught it, Davin said. You wouldn't recognize it from the outside. It is not a word in the traditional sense. It is a biological attachment marker. Velhari children produce them for their primary bonds in early development. They are not usually formed with new people after age 4. She looked at him with that still, measuring expression. The word it most closely approximates in the galactic standard rendering of Velhari attachment biology is ****, which designates a parent figure who is not the birth parent. A consistent, safe caretaker to whom the child has attached in the primary bond register. The room was quiet. The nearest equivalent in galactic standard, the sovereign voice said, is Dad***. Davin looked at her. She held his gaze. Across the room, Velara had catalogued all of the sound tools items and was now sitting with her hands in her lap, and Davin became aware, with the particular alertness that 11 days of tracking Velara had developed in him, that she had angled herself toward them, that she was tracking him, that she had been tracking him since he stopped moving, maintaining his position in the room the way she maintained all known points, steady and certain. He became aware, a moment later, that she had made a sound. Not loud. Not a word in any language he'd studied. A single syllable, subharmonic, the biological attachment marker the sovereign voice had just described, directed across the room with absolute scent-tracking accuracy. His translation unit, calibrated to Velhari social registers since day 3, rendered it in the margin of its display as a single word. Dad. The sovereign voice's breath changed. Davin's breath changed too, and he was aware of it from a slight distance, as though the ordinary mechanisms of his body were running on some independent track, while the rest of him stood in this room, and processed the fact that a 7-year-old girl on the other side of it had tracked him across 9 days and 200 meters of station corridor and multiple meals and 1 formal security presentation, and had called him, with the calm, certain, biological precision of a child who has decided a thing is true and has been acting on it since the decision was made, by a name he had never thought would have particular resonance in his life. Dad, Velara said again. Louder this time. The subharmonic of it filled the small room, the particular resonance of Velhari's speech, the vibration in the sternum, but specific now, directed, carrying the weight of 9 days of patient certainty. She slid off the bench. She walked toward him, not the careful mapping walk, not the deliberate, air-reading navigation she used in unfamiliar spaces. The confident, unhesitating trajectory of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has decided that arriving is the only relevant task. Her face was not careful. It was not measured or formal or the settled pragmatism of a child who has learned to manage uncertainty. It was the open, happy, decisive face of a child moving towards something she has been certain of for 9 days and is now done waiting to reach. She walked into his arms and wrapped hers around his waist and pressed her face against him, and said it again, said it the way she had not said words for 4 months, the way she had not said anything to Selen or the security detail or the diplomatic staff, or any of the 200 Velhari who had been trying to care for her since Ren Caveth, said it happy and unequivocal, and loud enough that the diplomatic staff turned from their work, and the security detail went very still. Dad. Davin put his arms around her. He held on. In the silence that followed, the particular, complete silence of a room full of people who have just witnessed something they did not expect and do not quite have vocabulary for, he looked up and found the sovereign voice watching him. Her expression was the one he had seen when she'd come through the transport doors and her assessment had come back clean. Not the formal face, not the measuring one. The other one, the one that was not for formal situations, the one that had no practiced distance in it. He did not know, standing in that room with a small child's arms around his waist, what the following weeks would look like, what the diplomatic office would require, what the political situation around the Keth-Sova succession would mean for a station logistics coordinator who had become, by a process of sitting down in corridors and bringing warm drinks in the morning, something a royal child called Dad. He did not know how any of it resolved in the practical terms of clearance levels and governance structures, and the long administrative aftermath of a collapsed accord. What he knew was the weight of a child against his chest, and the sound of a word that had apparently been his for 9 days before he knew it. He knew that Velara had found him in the cafeteria on day 2, in the corridor on day 3, in the cafeteria every morning since, with the patient and systematic and unnegotiable certainty of someone who has identified a fixed point and intends to keep it, and that, when she had completed the distance between herself and what she was looking for, she had arrived happy. That was what he knew. The rest was a logistics problem. Davin Cole was, among other things, very good at logistics. He looked at the sovereign voice across the small room, above the white-haired head of her daughter, and said quietly, "We should talk." She looked at him for a moment with that expression he didn't have a name for yet. "Yes," she said, "we should." Velara, apparently satisfied that the adults had reached an appropriate conclusion, tightened her arms around Davin's waist, turned her face outward toward the room, and remained exactly where she was, the serene, decided posture of a child who has been looking for something, found it by scent across 11 days and a collapsed accord and a transit terminal and a station cafeteria, and has no intention of losing it again. The room adjusted around her. As rooms, Davin was beginning to understand, tended to do.